Tonight we will explore the topic of mental health from the perspective of faith and prayer. And to help us do that, please welcome our guests. My partner in ministry and our Women's History Month co-host is Jacqui Burton, President of the Conference of National Black Churches. And with us also, faith community leader and mental health advocate, Reverend Kim Murray Cruse. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Thank you. And you know, it's so interesting, these two dynamics, right? Women's History Month, with the great challenges that women have had to go through, the great barriers that women have had to climb over to try to get to the place of accomplishment. And there's much accomplishment today. Yet there is plaguing us various psychological and health notions that prevent women and people of color from fully becoming all that they are. And so it's just great to have both of you here tonight to talk about this issue in Women's History Month and the issue of mental health and its consequences on our community.
Absolutely.
So again, let me welcome you and tell you how grateful I am to have you both sharing in this moment, which is a pretty moment. I guess I want to start with the question. Reverend Kim, this is such an important topic, and according to research, this is what we know. We know that 13.4% of the U.S. population identifies as Black or African Americans. That's about 46 million people. Of that number, approximately 16%, about 7 million people, reported having mental illness last year, according to the Mental Health America. Now, we also know that in the past there's been a stigma associated with mental illness in the African American community, and to be very honest, perpetuated in many faith communities within the African American community. But given that 7 million people reported having mental illness, what do you think has happened or is happening? And do you think that COVID-19 has anything to do with the uptick, if we can call it that?
Absolutely. What I personally believe is that COVID-19 exacerbated issues that were already there, right? So there was already an issue of mental illness, and COVID-19, in particular, people being isolated, people not being able to communicate with relatives and loved ones and do some of the things that they've always done, like go to church on a consistent basis. Those things exacerbated what was already there. So absolutely, the isolation of COVID-19 increased that.
Yeah. Reverend Kim, as a part of the Black Church, do you believe that the Black Church has been able to really embrace and understand and minister to persons who have mental illness?
Yes and no. Yes, the Black Church has always been able to minister to people with mental illness. The Black Church is a central space in the community as I would say a crisis relief space. So the Black Church is there as a catch-all for everything. So it has been ministering to people with mental illness, but it's oftentimes not doing the most effective job at doing that because it at times isolates people with mental illness by not embracing the fact that they need help, by ignoring some of those issues. We think about it being Women's Month, right? We think about domestic violence in particular. What we do know is that 40% of women reported domestic violence during the pandemic, the first year of the pandemic, and on record, maybe about 60% of Black congregations are women. So if we're thinking about those numbers, there has to be something that is done to kind of catch those women of color that are suffering from domestic violence, which is a mental health issue. So when you think about what our response is and whether or not we're actually catering to mental illness or even confronting it, we at times are increasing that stigma by just ignoring it. Right. So the answer is yes, because we're there to as a trusted ally in the community. But no, because we're not always willing to embrace those issues and actually address them head on.
What are the initiatives that you are really promoting and advocating in your ministry?
For me, prayer is one of the things that I'm advocating. I believe that prayer, as well as a therapist will help to sustain people's mental health. I think personally that saying to someone that it's okay for you to speak to God, knowing that I think maybe about 40 to 50% of believers believe they're actually hearing from God, according to the Pew.com. So if we think about that, knowing that people are using their relationship with God as a coping mechanism, knowing that there is research that supports that our brains do change when we are praying, that it increases serotonin, knowing that those things are occurring, and coupling that with actual clinical therapy, I think is something that is helpful. So that's what I encourage in my ministry. I encourage people to have a relationship with God, to pray, and to also see a therapist. Both are helpful.
Let me ask you a question. What innovative kinds of activity have you been engaged in as relates to trying to bring the Black church towards a more relevant addressing of mental health challenges?
So I created, at Grace Baptist Church in Mount Vernon, I created a ministry called Grace GPS, which stands for Grace Guidance Prayer Strength. And it is a ministry model that assists the Black church with how to embrace mental health and put that into the actual fabric of the ministry. So when we're thinking about whether or not it would be me preaching from the pulpit and addressing mental illness in sermons, it also is about us praying and being intentional about our prayers and actually being honest with God when we're praying. So when we are praying and we're honest with God, and those who are praying with you can hear what it is that you're praying about, we can then begin to address head on some of those issues. One of the things that we are also doing is we're strengthening the congregation with talks that reflect that of professionals coming in and maybe addressing domestic violence or alcoholism, things like that strengthen the core. The bereavement ministry, having people that are trained and licensed to actually give bereavement advice and help, to train those deacons and people who are in the congregation that are willing to help and be the hands that embrace other congregants. By training them, we're able to address that. So one of the things that I've also been an advocate of is youth mental health first aid as well as adult mental health first aid. And it works almost like CPR. Right, but it is for mental health. So what it does is it promotes the fact that you're able to identify when someone is having a break from reality, perhaps. What we do know is that 1 in 5 people will have a mental health challenge per year. Right, so it's 3 of us here, and we have others around us. So when we think about that, someone in this space will have a mental health challenge this year. And it's about making sure that those of us who are not having that challenge are able to help that person. So we know how to identify what that challenge is. So that's what adult mental health first aid, or youth mental health first aid is able to do. As well as embracing things like Soul Shop for the Black church, which is a curriculum that was created by Reverend Daphne Swinton and some other members of the faith community to really delve into what suicide awareness looks like, right? So those are some of the things that I'm advocating in our space.
Well, I guess this last thing I want to close with. Do you think that there's a sociological economic impact caused by mental illness on the upward rise or the downward slope of the African American economics and community resources?
Absolutely. I would absolutely connect the two. It is, in my opinion, that whatever the country is going through, once it hits the Black community, it's always heightened, right? So when we think about just soup kitchens, when we think about things that resources in our community that are strained, they have been strained even more so because of the pandemic. And now we have what we consider New Yorkers that are coming in, and we think about how this pandemic has caused things like the people to leave their jobs, has caused people to even, in some cases, lose their jobs. We think about how the pandemic has shut certain businesses down permanently. Churches, some are closed, some are open. You know, when we think about how this pandemic has affected just our community overall, absolutely. It has, at this point, become an issue. Mental health is not something that is in a vacuum. It affects every area of life. So spirituality, every area.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, Jacqui, for joining us. I think our audience is strengthened by this conversation. We're committed on this show to constantly raising new trends and ways we can cause the Black church to think afresh and to rid ourselves of some of the things that have eliminated us from being effective. And one of them has been the way we've approached mental health and embraced the stigmas.
Absolutely.
We got to break down the stigmas.
Absolutely.
People like you in ministry who are prepared to talk about this will help us get there. Again, thank you both for joining us today, and we look forward to some more conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Stay with us. Welcome back. Tonight we are exploring the topic of mental health from the perspective of faith and prayer. I'm joined by faith community leader, mental health advocate, and preacher, Reverend Cruse, and my partner in this ministry, Ms. Jacqui Burton, president of the Conference of National Black Churches. What a riveting discussion this has been thus far.
Kim, it has been so helpful for you to be with us in this space, particularly as we experience COVID. What do you see in your ministry that can be related to real life circumstances?
So relating to real life circumstances, what has increased for me has been my listening skills. Being able to listen to congregants while they're praying, and then being able to address their issues with real life resources. One of those resources is the Faith Affirming Directory that I co-authored and has been embraced by the Westchester County Department of Mental Health. So that resource and that directory is on my website, and that directory embraces faith-affirming counselors. Right, so the questionnaire that I co-authored with Reverend Swinton, we were able to identify counselors that were comfortable discussing faith as it relates to mental illness with people in synagogues, mosques, churches, and this questionnaire that led to a directory is there for the faith community. So there are about 60 counselors in the New York City area, all of New York, including Westchester, that are there and willing to work with people of faith who have identified that their faith is important to them as they are trying to overcome mental illness. So that's one of the things that I believe is a resource for the community.
Given all that we've talked about tonight, it's been quite a powerful, and for me, this is one of the great discussions that the Black church got to have. What do you do, based on your experience, what do you think we can do collectively, the church, going forward, to address the issue of Black, aside from listening?
Right.
What can we do? What can we do organically as denominations? What can we do to begin this process? It's not an overnight solution, but we've got to have, and I want to hear from you and tell me.
Absolutely. One of the things we can do is to embrace education. Right, we can embrace education, whether it is youth and adult mental health first aid, whether it is assist, soul shop for the Black church, or whether or not it's safe talks. These are things that have been created to assist us in these times of distress. We can embrace the fact that mental illness is here. Right, we can stop ignoring it. We can also have sermons from the pulpit to the pews. We can begin to address real life circumstances. Some of the work that is done from the sermon perspective is very important. People are listening to the church and listening to their pastors, and they're waiting to hear what they have to say about real life circumstances. So the more we begin to address that, we begin to address stigma and relate it to actual people that have suffered in the Bible. When we begin to embrace those types of narratives, we can see all sorts of things biblically, whether it be suicide, that is also biblical. Suicide ideation. Depression is there, desperation is there.
Yes.
Right? If we're able to address that, we can promote hope.
Wonderful. Well, Reverend Cruse, Jacqui Burton, I'm delighted to have had you all join us tonight in this important dialogue. And in this time when we are paying tribute to the role that women have played in the history of our nation, God knows in the history of our churches. And it's a time to celebrate, but it's also a time to focus on how we make better what we've been handed. So thank you for being here tonight, and God bless you in your work. We'll be right back.